Dust hung like old grief over Iron Hollow. Amos Kane, calloused hands gripping splintered wood, watched the auction block. A woman stood there, burlap sack swallowing her head, wrists bound with frayed rope. Rough laughter echoed off sun-baked buildings. $2 was all he had left after supplies. A gamble on a ghost. Then, beneath the jeers, a whisper sliced the air. Eliza Wren. His breath hitched. A name, a memory, sharp and buried deep. "I'll pay," he rasped, the words changing everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something extra special saved just for you. The Wyoming Territory in the dying days of 1878 held a particular kind of desolation. Iron Hollow wasn't a town so much as a scar on the landscape, a cluster of weathered, gray timber buildings huddled around a single rutted street that vanished into the endless, rolling sea of sagebrush and parched earth. The air shimmered with heat even this late in the year, thick with the scent of dust, horse dung, and the faint, metallic tang of despair. Flies buzzed with lethargic persistence around the water trough near the livery stable, the only sign of moisture for miles. The creak of a weary mule cart, laden with sacks of grain, was the day's sole rhythm, punctuated by the occasional shout from saloon swinging doors. Amos Kane stood apart, leaning against the rough-hewn post of the general store's porch. He was a man shaped by solitude and the relentless bite of the axe. 40 winters, maybe more, had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. The color leached from his hair beneath the wide brim of his worn felt hat. His canvas coat was patched at the elbows, his boots scarred and thick with dried mud. In his pocket, the cool, smooth weight of a tarnished silver locket was a familiar anchor, a secret touchstone against the raw edge of the world. He'd come for salt, flour, and kerosene. He hadn't come for an auction. Yet, there she was, dragged roughly onto the makeshift platform, 2 planks laid across barrels, outside the saloon. A figure shrouded in coarse, stained burlap, the sack cinched tight around her neck with rope, completely obscuring her face, her identity. Her hands, small and surprisingly clean against the grime of her simple homespun dress, were bound at the wrists with the same frayed cord. She stood unnervingly still, a silent effigy amidst the burgeoning crowd of miners, drifters, and the hard-bitten women who survived them. "Right then, gents," bellowed Jedediah Pike, the auctioneer. A mountain of man with a beard like tangled wire and eyes like chips of flint. He wiped sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Opportunity knocks. Sturdy enough, see? Needs a firm hand, no doubt. Sold as is for labor or companionship. Who'll start the bid? $1? Do I hear $1? A ripple of coarse laughter went through the dozen or so gathered men. Amos felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut. This was commerce at its most brutal, stripping humanity down to utility. He'd seen it before, the desperate trade in people fleeing worse fates or caught in the undertow of the frontier. He shouldered a sack of supplies, ready to turn away, to retreat to the muffled sanity of the pines and his isolated cabin miles north. Let the wolves have their sport. "Come on now. She don't bite, leastways, not that I seen." Jed roared, grabbing the woman's arm. She flinched a tiny, almost imperceptible recoil, but held her ground. Her bound hands clenched into fists for a fleeting second. Silent type. Good for working. "Who'll give me $1? 50 cents! A pockmarked miner near the front yelled, eliciting more guffaws. "For that sack o' mystery? Might be ugliest and under there." Amos's gaze lingered. It wasn't just pity, though that stirred cold and deep. It was the unnerving stillness of her, the way she held herself despite the fear he sensed radiating from her like heat haze. It was a glimpse of her wrists, pale against the rope and thin, faded blue ribbon tied loosely around one, a whisper color of something cherished amidst the drab horror. And then, as the jeers rose again, a sound cut through the din, so soft Amos almost thought he'd imagined it. A muffled word, choked but clear, spoken directly towards him, it seemed, from within that stifling sack. "Eliza, His blood turned to ice. Eliza, the name echoed in the hollow chamber of his memory, sharp and sudden, like a shard of glass unearthed. Not his late wife, Sarah. No, someone else. A fragment of face glimpsed years ago, half lost in the swirling white fury of mountain blizzard, a cry for help on a desolate trail. Hastily answered and then buried beneath the weight of his own subsequent losses? The connection was maddeningly vague, a half-formed ghost, but it resonated with an undeniable, painful force. It stopped him dead. Wren, the muffled voice added, even softer, almost swallowed by the sack. Eliza Wren. Eliza Wren. The name settled, heavy and strange. Recognition flared again, brighter this time, yet still obscured, like a lamp seen through thick fog. Who? When? The questions hammered against his ribs. It was a name that belonged to a different time, a different Amos, before the axe became his only companion and grief his familiar shadow. All right, 50 cents it is. Jed boomed, mistaking the miner's shout for a bid. Going once. Amos stepped forward, pushing through the edge of the crowd. His voice, rough from disuse and the ever-present sawdust, cut through the noise. $2. Silence fell, thick and surprised. Heads turned. $2 was a week's wages for some men here, a reckless sum for a sight-unseen burden. Jed squinted, a slow, calculating grin spreading across his face. Well now, Amos Kane. Didn't figure you for the market. $2, gents. Any advance on $2? The pockmarked miner spat. Ain't worth 2 bits, Kane. You gone soft in the head. Amos ignored him, his eyes fixed on the sack-shrouded figure. Eliza Wren. He saw her shoulders tense, heard the faint, shaky intake of breath beneath the burlap. Her bound hands twitched. He pulled the 2 worn silver dollars from his pouch, the last coins he possessed. They felt heavy, final. I'll pay. Jed snatched the coins, biting one quickly before pocketing them with a satisfied grunt. Sold. To the quiet man with the axe. She's your problem now, Kane. Papers are, well, let's say they're implied. He gave a coarse laugh and roughly shoved the woman toward the edge of the platform. Off you go, darling. Mind your new master. Amos moved quickly, catching her elbow before she stumbled. Her arm was thin beneath the rough fabric, trembling slightly. He felt the flinch again at his touch. Easy, he murmured, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. He drew his knife, a simple bone-handled blade, and sawed through the rope binding her wrists. The frayed ends fell away. She brought her hands together, rubbing the red marks, her fingers brushing against the faded blue ribbon. She didn't remove the sack. Come on, Amos said, his voice low. He shouldered his supplies again and turned toward the edge of the outpost where his old mule, Balthazar, stood tethered in the scant shade of a skeletal cottonwood. He didn't look back, trusting she would follow. The walk through Iron Hollow was excruciating. Whispers trailed him, crude remarks bitten off only when Amos turned his head, his gaze flat and cold. He felt her presence behind him, a silent shadow, keeping a careful distance. The only sound was the scuff of her worn shoes on the hard-packed earth and the dry rustle of the burlap sack. They reached Balthazar. The mule flicked an ear, regarding the sack-headed figure with mild suspicion. Amos secured the supplies to the pack saddle. He didn't offer her the mule. He didn't know if she could ride, and the journey ahead, over rocky, uneven trails into the deepening wilderness, was treacherous enough on foot. He simply started walking, leading Balthazar by the reins. The sun began its long descent, painting the sagebrush plains in shades of ochre and deepening purple. The vast emptiness pressed in, a familiar companion to Amos, but he wondered what it felt like to the woman walking silently behind him, blindfolded by burlap, sold for $2 silver. The miles unspooled slowly. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot, Balthazar's occasional snort, the sigh of the wind through the brush, and the distant cry of a hawk. Amos kept his pace steady, allowing for her. He didn't speak. What was there to say? He stole glances back. She walked with a surprising steadiness, head tilted slightly as if listening intently to the world she couldn't see. Her hands, now free, were often clasped together near her waist, the faded blue ribbon sometimes catching the fading light. Her resilience, this quiet endurance within the shroud, both unnerved him and stirred a reluctant, protective respect. The trail wound upwards into the foothills, the air growing cooler, scented now with pine resin and damp earth. The towering silhouettes of the bitterroot pines, Amos's domain, began to rise against the twilight sky. After another hour, they rounded a bend, and there it was, his cabin, a humble structure of hand-hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing beside a chattering creek. Smoke curled thinly from the stone chimney. A stack of cut was stood neatly against one wall. It was a place of order carved from chaos, a refuge built with sweat and grief. Amos stopped at the edge of the clearing, Balthazar nudging his shoulder. He turned. Eliza Wren stood a few paces back, a dark, shapeless figure against the deepening twilight. She had stopped walking. Her head, encased in the sack, was turned toward the cabin. He couldn't see her face, couldn't read her expression, but her posture radiated a sudden, profound hesitation. One hand rose slightly, fingers brushing the rough burlap near her throat, as if testing its presence. The other hand clutched the worn blue ribbon on her wrist, twisting it nervously. "Home," Amos said, the word sounding strange and overly familiar. He gestured toward the cabin door, its simple latch visible in the gloom. "You can take that off now." He meant the sack. The thought of her entering his space, still concealed, felt profoundly wrong. She didn't move towards the door. Instead, she took a single, hesitant step backwards, away from the cabin, toward the dark line of the trees. Her bound hands, now free, twisted the blue ribbon tighter. Then, as if steeling herself, she slowly raised her hands toward the knotted rope, securing the sack under her chin. Her fingers fumbled, clumsy with nerves or the tightness of the knot. Amos watched, a knot of his own tightening in his chest. He took a step closer, intending perhaps to help, though the idea felt intrusive. As he did, the last slanting rays of the setting sun, piercing through the pines, caught the exposed skin of her forearm just below the pushed-up sleeve of her dress. And there, stark against the pale skin, partly obscured by the edge of the faded ribbon she clutched, was a mark, not a bruise from the ropes, an old mark, a small, distinct shape, faded silvery white against her skin, a perfect tiny crescent moon. Amos froze. His breath stopped. The tarnished locket in his pocket seemed to burn against his thigh. A crescent moon. He knew that mark. He'd seen it before long ago on the wrist of a terrified girl half buried in a snowdrift on the Bozeman Trail, her family's wagon shattered by the storm. He'd pulled her free, given her his last biscuit, wrapped her in his own blanket before a passing troop wagon took her towards Fort Laramie. He'd never known her name. Only the desperate grip of her small, cold hand and the faint, pale crescent moon on her wrist, visible as he adjusted the blanket. Eliza? Could it possibly? The sack slipped from her fingers as she finally loosened the knot, falling away to pull around her shoulders like a grotesque cowl. But Amos wasn't looking at her face yet. His eyes were locked on that mark, the impossible echo from a buried past, glowing faintly in the dying light. The sack fell away, a coarse shadow pulling around Eliza Wren's shoulders, but Amos Kane saw only the mark, that small, pale crescent moon on her wrist, glowing faintly in the last bloody light of the setting sun. It was a brand seared onto his memory, not from fire, but from ice and desperation. The Bozeman Trail, the screaming wind, the suffocating white blindness of a blizzard years past, the splintered wreckage of a wagon, half buried, the frantic digging with numb hands until he found her. Not this woman, but a girl, barely more than child, trembling and blue-lipped beneath the snow. He'd wrapped her in his own threadbare blanket, pressed his last hard biscuit into her frozen fingers, and seen it then, that same silvery crescent moon on her small, exposed wrist. He'd never known her name, only the overwhelming relief when a military patrol's wagon, struggling to the storm, had taken her towards Fort Laramie's uncertain sanctuary. He'd buried that memory beneath the heavier griefs that followed, thinking her loss of the vast, indifferent frontier. Now here she stood, Eliza Wren, the girl from the snow, grown, sold for $2 with a sack over her head. Eliza flinched under his intense stare, her free hand instinctively flying up to cover the mark, her fingers tangling with the faded blue ribbon still tied there. Her eyes, wide and the color of storm-washed slate, darted from Amos's face to the cabin door, then back to the darkening wood behind her. Fear wore with profound exhaustion in her expression. She hadn't fully removed the sack. It hung like a grotesque cape, framing a face that was gaunt, smudged with dust and the grime of the burlap, but undeniably holding the echo of that terrified child. High cheekbones sharpened by hardship, a stubborn set to her jaw beneath the vulnerability. Inside, Amos managed, his voice thick. The word felt inadequate, charged with the weight of the revelation. He gestured again toward the cabin door, deliberately softening his gaze, trying to mute the shock he knew must be written plain on his own weathered face. Cold set in. Eliza hesitated, her gaze lingering on the trees. Then slowly, cautiously, she took a step forward, then another, her movement stiff, as if every joint protested. She kept the bundled sack clutched in one hand, the other still protectively covering her wrist. Amos moved aside, letting her pass first into the dim interior. He followed, pulling the heavy door shut against the gathering night, the solid thunk of punctuation mark ending the bizarre procession from Iron Hollow. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace where embers glowed dully. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine resin from the freshly split logs stacked by the hearth, and the earthy scent of the packed dirt floor. A rough-hewn table stood near the fire, flanked by two sturdy stools. A narrow cot lay against one wall, covered with a faded wool blanket. Opposite it, Amos's own bunk was neatly made. Shelves held basic supplies: tins, sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserves. Tools, axes, saws, a draw knife, hung neatly on pegs. It was a space of frugal order, a testament to solitude. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, a silhouette against the fading light from the single small window. She scanned the room with quick, darting glances, taking the Spartan details, the lack of any softness beyond the worn blanket on the cot. Her shoulders remained tense, the bundled sack held close to her chest like a shield. Amos busied himself, kneading the motion. He added a few split logs to the fire, coaxing a reluctant flame. The growing light pushed back the shadows, revealing the lines of fatigue etched deep around Eliza's eyes. He filled a blackened kettle from a water bucket and hung it over the fire. "Sit," he offered, nodding toward the stool farthest from his bunk. "Warm yourself." She didn't move immediately, her eyes fixed on the cot. His bunk was clearly defined. The other cot, was it meant for her? A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Relief? Suspicion? Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the indicated stool and sat perched on its edge, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the flames. She placed the bundled sack carefully on the floor beside her feet, within easy reach. Silence stretched, thick and awkward, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the kettle beginning to sing. Amos rummaged in the sack, pulling out hardtack biscuits and a small wedge of cheese. He placed them on a chip plate and set it on the table near her, then poured 2 tin mugs of hot water. "Food," he said simply, placing one mug beside the plate. He took his own mug and retreated to the opposite side of the fireplace, leaning against the rough logs, giving her space. He watched her, not directly, but from the corner of his eye. She stared at the plate, then at him, then back at the food. Hunger warred with caution in her posture. Finally, with a movement so quick it was almost furtive, she snatched a biscuit and retreated back into the shadow corner of her stool, turning slightly away from him. She ate in small, bird-like bites, her head bowed, the firelight catching the tangled, dark braid that fell over her shoulder. She didn't touch the cheese. She didn't drink the water until it had cooled considerably, sipping cautiously. Amos ate his own biscuit mechanically, his mind churning. The girl from the blizzard. Eliza Wren. How had she come to this? Soul like chattel in Iron Hollow? The memory of her small, frozen hand gripping his, the desperate whimpers muffled by the storm's roar, clashed violently with the image of her standing mute on the auction block, shrouded in burlap. A fierce, protective urge surged within him, unexpected and raw. He hadn't saved her then just to abandon her to this now. But the questions, they hung heavy in the smoky air. Why the sack? What horrors lay between the blizzard and the auction block? And why had she whispered her name to him? He noticed her shiver, a slight tremor running through her thin frame, despite the fire's growing heat. Her dress was threadbare, offering little protection against the mountain night's chill seeping through the logs. Without a word, Amos moved to a small trunk at the foot of his bunk. He lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and camphor rising. Inside lay folded fabrics, remnants of a life before solitude. His fingers brushed against soft wool. He pulled out a woman's shawl, deep green with faded embroidery along the edges. Sarah's shawl. The familiar ache bloomed in his chest, dull and constant. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before carrying it over to Eliza. She flinched as he approached, drawing back slightly on the stool. Amos stopped a few feet away, holding out the shawl. "For the cold," he said, his voice low. Eliza stared at the offered garment, then at his face. Her storm-gray eyes searched his, looking for deception, for threat. Seeing only the quiet, weathered lines of his face and the earnestness in his steady gaze, she slowly, hesitantly, reached out. Her fingers, cold despite the fire, brushed the soft wool. She took it, pulling it quickly into her lap, unfolding it with reverence. She didn't put it on immediately. Instead, she traced a faded floral pattern with one fingertip, a gesture so vulnerable it tightened Amos's throat. Then, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders, pulling it close, she gave the barest nod. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the fire's crackle. It was the first thing she'd said since whispering her name. The simple gratitude, the acceptance of this small comfort, felt like a fragile bridge built across a chasm. Amos nodded back, a silent acknowledgement. He retreated to the side of the fire, the tarnished locket a cold weight against his chest beneath his shirt. The crescent moon. He needed to see it again. Needed to confirm the impossible connection wasn't just a trick of the fading light and his own haunted memories. Later, as the fire burned low and the deep silence of the pines pressed against the cabin walls, Eliza finally succumbed to exhaustion. She sat slumped on a stool, her head resting against the log wall, the green shawl pulled high around her neck, her breathing slow and even. The bundled sack lay forgotten on the floor beside her. Amos remained awake, watchful. The protective instinct warred with the gnawing need to understand. He moved silently, stepping closer to where she slept. The firelight played softly over her face, smoothing away some of the strain. Her hand, resting on her lap, was relaxed. The blue ribbon on her wrist was visible, and there, just above it, lay the crescent moon mark, pale and distinct in the flickering glow. His breath caught. It was the same. Undeniably, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, Amos carefully, slowly, reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the cool silver of the locket. He pulled it out, the chain catching the firelight. He hadn't opened it in years. The pain within was too sharp, but now he needed to see. With trembling fingers, he found the tiny catch. It resisted, stiff with disuse and tarnish. He applied careful pressure. It sprang open with a faint snick. The miniature portraits inside were faded, the colors dimmed by time and grief. On one side, Sarah, her gentle smile, her kind eyes forever captured in sepia tones. Amos's heart clenched. He forced his gaze to the other side. Not a portrait, a tiny, intricate drawing, rendered in delicate ink lines on ivory. A symbol, a perfect crescent moon, identical to the mark on Eliza Wren's wrist. Amos stared, his blood turning to ice water. Why? Why did he carry this symbol? Sarah had given him the locket long before the blizzard, long before he'd ever seen that mark on the girl in the snow. She'd never explained the drawing, only smiled that secretive smile of hers when he'd asked. A reminder, Amos, she'd said, a reminder of something precious lost, and maybe someday found. He'd thought it merely sentimental, abstract. He'd never connected it to anything real. But now it wasn't abstract. It was here, etched on the wrist of a woman he'd bought at auction, a woman he'd rescued years ago. A symbol Sarah had treasured. What did it mean? What dangerous thread connected his dead wife, this scarred woman sleeping fitfully on a stool, and the cryptic mark they shared? The locket felt suddenly heavy, not with grief, but with a terrifying, unknown significance. He snapped it shut, the sound loud in the silent cabin, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked from the closed locket in his palm to the sleeping Eliza, the crescent moon on her wrist now seeming less like a memory and more like a brand, a mark of something far deeper and infinitely more perilous than he could have ever imagined. The safe solitude of his cabin felt like an illusion, shattered by the echo of a symbol and the sleeping woman who wore its twin. The snick of the locket closing echoed like a gunshot in the silent cabin. Amos Kane stood frozen, the cool silver biting into his palm, his gaze darting between the small, closed trinket and the sleeping woman. Eliza Wren, the crescent moon on her wrist, pale in the dying firelight, was no longer just a mark of past rescue. It was a cipher, a dangerous echo of the symbol Sarah had cherished, hidden within the locket she'd given him, a reminder of something precious lost, and maybe, someday, found. Sarah's words, whispered years ago with that secretive smile, now felt like shards of ice in his heart. Found? Found like this? Sold at auction? What cruel thread bound his gentle Sarah to this haunted woman? Eliza stirred, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Her head rolled slightly against the log wall, the green shawl slipping down to reveal the tense line of her neck. Amos quickly pocketed the locket, its weight suddenly ominous. He couldn't let her see his turmoil, not yet. The fragile trust built by the shawl, the shared food, felt as delicate as frost on a window pane. He banked a fire, adding another log to sustain warmth through the deep mountain night, then retreated to his bunk. He didn't sleep. He lay rigid, staring into the darkness where the rafters vanished, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of another person breathing in his solitary refuge. The wind picked up outside, moaning through the dense stands of bitterroot pines, a sound that usually soothed him but now felt like a lament. Every creak of the settling logs, every rustle from Eliza's corner, sent his nerves jangling. Who was she? What did the moon mean? And what shadow did it cast over this fragile sanctuary? Dawn came grudgingly, gray light seeping to the cabin's single small window. Amos rose silently, moving with the ingrained quiet of a man used to solitude. Eliza was still asleep, curled awkwardly on a stool, the shawl pulled tightly around her, her face softened in repose but still etched with the ghost of hardship. The bundled sack lay beside her, a dark blot on the dirt floor. He moved past her to the door, easing it open just enough to slip out into the chill morning air. The world was hushed, bathed in mist that clung to the lower branches of the pines like damp wool. The scent of pine resin and wet earth was sharp and clean. Amos took deep breaths, trying to clear the cloying dread from his lungs. He checked the perimeter of the clearing out of habit, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing seemed amiss. Balthazar, tethered in his lean-to, whickered softly in greeting. The familiar routine of feeding the mule, chopping kindling, drawing fresh, icy water from the creek, grounded him momentarily. But the questions buzzed relentlessly beneath the surface, louder than the distant rush of water. When he returned, Eliza was awake. She stood by the cold hearth, her back to him, carefully folding the green shawl with a reverence that tightened Amos's chest. She placed it neatly on the stool she'd occupied, then turned. Her storm-gray eyes met his, clear and watchful in the morning light. There was less raw fear today, replaced by a deep, weary wariness. She glanced at the water bucket he carried. "Need water?" Amos asked, setting the bucket down near the hearth. She nodded, a small, decisive movement. Then, unexpectedly, she gestured toward the pile of kindling he brought in. "I can stoke it." Her voice was husky and used, but clear. The offer, small as it was, felt monumental, a step beyond mere acceptance. "All right," Amos said, trying to keep his tone neutral. He moved aside as she knelt before the hearth, her movements economical and surprisingly deft as she arranged the kindling and coaxed the embers back to life. He watched her hands, capable, slender, the crescent moon mark partially visible below the sleeve of her threadbare dress, near the faded blue ribbon. The sight of it sent a fresh jolt through him, the image of the identical drawing in the locket flashing in his mind. He busied himself preparing a sparse breakfast, more hardtack, a thin gruel of oats. As they ate in silence at the rough table, the fire crackling warmly now, Amos wrestled with how to broach the impossible. He couldn't ignore the symbol. It was a key to everything, her past, her presence, its terrifying link to Sarah. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough. She looked up from her bowl, her gaze guarded but attentive. He hesitated, then plunged on, choosing his words with care. "That mark on your wrist." He gestured vaguely. "The moon. I've seen it before." Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her spoon clattered into her bowl. Her free hand flew to cover her left wrist, clutching it protectively, her knuckles whitening around the blue ribbon. Her eyes widened, not just with fear now, but with dawning horror. She pushed her stool back sharply, the legs scraping loudly on the dirt floor. "Where?" The word was a gasp, sharp as a knife thrust. "Where did you see it?" Her intensity startled him. "Years back," Amos said slowly, keeping his own voice low and steady, trying to project calm. "On the Bozeman Trail, in a blizzard, found a girl buried near a wrecked wagon. Pulled her out. Saw it then on her wrist, just a glimpse." He paused, watching the color drain from her face. That was you?" Eliza stared at him, her breath coming in shallow hitches. Recognition warred with disbelief in her eyes. The terror of that long-ago storm seemed to resurface, momentarily eclipsing the present. She gave a single, jerky nod. "Yes," she whispered, the word thick. You gave me your blanket. The biscuit." A flicker of something like gratitude touched her eyes, quickly submerged again by the deeper dread. "But the mark." Her fingers tightened convulsively over her wrist. "It's not just mine." Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. "Not just yours." "It belonged to my mother," Eliza said, the words tumbling out now, low and urgent. "A family token, carved long ago, passed down, to be protected." Her eyes darted toward the cabin window, scanning the mist-shrouded pines as if expecting phantoms to materialize. But others, they know it. They seek it. They seek those who bear it. She looked back at Amos, her gaze piercing. "You recognize it. Then. Now." The implication hung heavy in the air. If you recognized it, who else might? The locket seemed to burn against Amos's chest. He wanted to ask about Sarah, about the drawing, but Eliza's palpable terror stopped him. Someone was seeking the crescent moon, seeking those who bore it. The isolation of the cabin, once a refuge, now felt terrifyingly exposed. Jedediah Pike had seen Eliza. Others in Iron Hollow had witnessed the auction. Gossip traveled faster than a stagecoach on these frontier trails. Later that afternoon, Amos needed to check his trap line further up the ridge. It was a necessary chore, but leaving Eliza alone in the cabin now filled him with a new, sharp anxiety. "Stay inside," he instructed, handing her the long rifle he usually kept above the door. He saw the flare of fear in her eyes at the weapon, quickly masked by grim determination. "Bar the door after me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Understand?" She nodded, gripping the rifle stock with white-knuckled intensity. "I understand." Her gaze held his, a silent acknowledgement of the shared danger, the fragile trust deepening under duress. He left, the image of her standing small but resolute in the dim cabin doorway seared into his mind. The trap line yielded little. A single scrawny rabbit. Amos's mind wasn't on the hunt. It churned with Eliza's words, the symbol, Sarah's locket. They seek it. They seek those who bear it. Who were they? And why? As he descended the ridge toward the creek that fed his water source, his practiced eye scanned the ground automatically. Near the muddy bank, partially obscured by a clump of bear grass, he saw it. A boot print. Fresh. Distinct. Not his own worn. Familiar tread. Larger. Deeper. The heel imprint was sharp, the sole pattern unfamiliar. Not the crisscross pattern common to miners or settlers, but something finer, almost military, and it pointed directly towards his cabin, half hidden in the pines on the other side of the clearing. Amos froze, the rabbit forgotten in his hand. Cold dread, colder than the mountain stream, seeped into his bones. Someone had been here, watching, close, while he was on the ridge. While Eliza was alone in the cabin, he scanned the tree line opposite, his hand instinctively going to the axe at his belt. The dense pines offered 1,000 places to hide. The wind sighed to the branches, suddenly sounding less like a lament and more like a warning. The peaceful isolation was shattered. The symbol on Eliza's wrist wasn't just a marker of past or a connection to Sarah's mystery. It was a target, and it seemed the hunter had already found the trail. Amos turned and ran, crashing to the undergrowth, the need to reach Eliza, to ensure she was still safe, a desperate drumbeat in his chest, louder than the pounding of his own terrified heart. The boot print wasn't just a sign, it was a declaration. The hunt was on. Amos Kane crashed through the last tangle of underbrush, lungs burning, the image of that sharp-heel boot print imprinted on his mind like a brand. The cabin clearing open before him, bathed in the long, slanting gold of late afternoon. His eyes scanned frantically. The door, still barred from the inside. The window, a dark rectangle. No signs of forced entry. No unnatural sounds beyond the sighing pines and the distant creek. Relief washed over him, cold and weak, followed instantly by a sharper spike of fear. Inside. Was she inside? Was she safe? He didn't call out. Moving with predatory silence honed by years in the woods, he skirted the edge of the clearing, axe held low and ready, his gaze raking the tree line opposite where the print had pointed. Nothing stirred but Jay, scolding from a high pine bough. Reaching the cabin door, he rapped sharply 3 times, their agreed signal. A heartbeat passed, filled with a hammering of his own pulse. Then came the scrape of the heavy wooden bar being lifted from within. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing one storm-gray eye, wide with fear and the glint of the rifle barrel. Amos! Eliza's voice was taut as a bowstring. "It's me," he rasped, pushing inside quickly, shutting and rebarring the door behind him with a solid thunk. The dim interior felt charged, thick with tension. Eliza lowered the rifle, her shoulders sagging, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the stock. The green shawl was draped over her shoulders again, a shield against more than the chill. "They were here," she whispered, her gaze darting to the small window. "While you were gone, I felt it, like ice down my back. Heard something. A boot scuff, maybe, close to the wall. Near the window." She shuddered, pulling the shawl tighter. "I didn't move. Didn't make a sound, just waited." The raw courage it must have taken, alone, weapon heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, facing an unseen threat, struck Amos deeply. "Good," he said, the word rough with feeling. He took the rifle from her trembling grip, his own hand briefly covering hers on the cool wood, a silent reassurance. "You did good." He checked the weapon, It was still loaded, the hammer back as he'd shown her. Saw a track down by the creek. Fresh. Not mine. Pointing this way. Eliza's breath hitched. Her hand instinctively flew to her left wrist, hidden beneath the shawl on her sleeve, covering the crescent moon. They know, she breathed, the horror in her eyes deepening. They know I'm here. Who, Eliza? Amos pressed, moving to peer cautiously through a crack in the window shutter. The clearing remained empty, the lengthening shadows pooling beneath the pines. Who seeks the mark? Why? She leaned against a rough-hewn table, looking suddenly exhausted, the defiance momentarily drained. Men without faces, men with money and long memories. Her voice was low, haunted. My mother, she called them the seekers of the silvered path. They serve something older, something that covets the crescent. It grants passage, she said, to hidden places, to power. They believe those who bear it hold the key, or are the key. She shook her head, frustration etching lines on her pale face. She told me little, only to hide it, to run if they ever came. They took her when I was young, after the blizzard, after Fort Laramie. I ran then, kept running, until... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the auction block, the sack, Iron Hollow, until I stopped running. Hidden places, power. The words echoed ominously in the quiet cabin. They felt alien, terrifying, grafted onto the harsh reality of the Wyoming frontier. Amos thought of the locket burning against his chest. Sarah is practical, kind Sarah, treasuring a drawing of the symbol. Had she known? Had she been part of this madness? The thought was a physical blow. We can't run now, Amos stated, the decision solidifying as he spoke. Not yet. They know the terrain. We don't know how many. He looked around the cabin, his fortress of solitude now a potential trap. We fortify, make him work for it. The shared purpose became a lifeline. Amos showed Eliza how to wedge the table more securely against the door. He moved the stacked firewood to create a low barrier inside the window, leaving only a narrow firing slit. He checked the load in his Old Navy Colt, then handed Eliza the rifle again. Watch the window, he instructed. Anything moves out there that ain't a deer or Balthazar, you call me. Loud. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of determination, a hardening resolve. She nodded, positioning herself carefully behind the woodpile barrier, the rifle resting on a log, pointed toward the shutter crack. The fading light outside painted stripes of gold across the dirt floor, creeping towards a hearth. Amos busied himself checking the chinking between the logs, reinforcing weak spots with wedges of wood. As he worked near the trunk at the foot of his bunk, his hand brushed against Sarah's shawl, folded neatly where Eliza had left it. A pang of grief, sharp and familiar. He lifted the shawl, the soft wool a tangible link to the past. Beneath it lay Sarah's few other belongings he'd kept. A small sewing kit, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, and a slim, leather-bound book he'd never dared open, her journal. He'd avoided it, the pain too raw. But now the symbol, the danger, demanded answers Sarah might have possessed. With trembling hands, driven by a desperate need to understand the thread connecting his wife to this hunted woman, he picked up the journal. The leather was smooth, worn at the edges. He opened it carefully. Sarah's neat, flowing script filled the pages, dates from years ago, accounts of their homesteading hopes, sketches of wildflowers, recipes. Then, near the end, the entries grew sparse, the handwriting tighter, more urgent. He flipped pages, his heart pounding, and there it was, a page dated mere weeks before the fever took her. No sketches of flowers, just words, stark and unsettling. Met with Brother Elias at the mission. He spoke of the old ways, the paths beneath the hills, of the silvered path seekers. He warned they are active again, drawn by whispers of the Crescent Key. He fears for those who bear the mark. Says they're not just guardians, but beacons. He gave me this for safekeeping. Says it's a fragment, a guide, should the darkness come seeking. I don't understand it all, but his fear was real. I feel a shadow. The entry ended abruptly. Tucked into the spine of the journal, almost concealed, was a small, folded piece of thick parchment. Amos carefully extracted it, unfolded. It revealed not writing, but a meticulously drawn symbol, a complex geometric pattern centered around a perfect crescent moon. It looked ancient, intricate, unlike the simple mark on Eliza's wrist or the drawing in the locket. Below it in Sarah's hand was a single phrase, where the crow's shadow falls. Amos stared, the cryptic phrase and the intricate symbol swimming before his eyes. Brother Elias? The mission near Iron Creek? A guide? Sarah had known. She'd been drawn into this, or at least warned of it, and she'd hidden this map, this key. Had her fever been just a fever? A cold, sickening dread coiled in Amos's gut. The shadow Eliza felt, had it fallen over Sarah first? A low sound from Eliza broke his trance, a sharp intake of breath. Amos snapped the journal shut, shoving the folded parchment into his pocket alongside the locket. He moved swiftly to her side of the window. "What?" he whispered, peering through the slit. Eliza pointed a trembling finger toward the edge of the clearing where the path entered the trees. The last rays of the setting sun glinted off something unnatural amidst the pine needles and fallen branches. Something small and white, pinned to the trunk of a young aspen tree. A piece of paper. Wasn't there before? Eliza breathed, her voice barely audible. "While you were looking," Amos's blood ran cold. A message, left while he was engrossed in Sarah's journal, mere yards from where Eliza stood watch. The intruder had been that close, bold enough to leave a marker. The brazenness was a threat in itself. "Cover me," Amos said, his voice tight. He checked the Colt, took a deep breath, then lifted the bar and eased the cabin door open just wide enough to slip out. The evening air was cool, the shadows deep beneath the pines. He moved low and fast, axe in one hand, Colt in the other, senses screaming toward the aspen tree. Reaching it, he scanned the darkening woods. Nothing, only the watchful silence of the trees. He snatched the paper pinned by a crude thorn. It was coarse, like wrapping paper. Scrawled on it in thick, dark ink, almost like charcoal, were 3 stark words. Moon Woman. Dawn. Amos crumpled the paper in his fist, the threat explicit. They weren't just watching. They were declaring their intent. They would come for Eliza at dawn. He turned back toward the cabin, where Eliza stood framed in the doorway, the rifle ready, her face a pale oval of fear in the gloom, the weight of the parchment fragment in his pocket, Sarah's cryptic phrase echoing in his mind, where the crow's shadow falls, and the crude deadline on the note collided. The seekers of the silvered path weren't just hunting Eliza. They were here, and the key to surviving the dawn might lie buried in the secrets of his dead wife, and a symbol etched on a woman he bought for $2. The fragile sanctuary of the cabin walls felt thinner than paper against the darkness gathering outside. The crumpled note felt like a live coal in Amos Kane's fist. Moon Woman. Dawn. The stark threat hung in the cooling evening air, heavier than the scent of pine smoke, clinging to the cabin. He met Eliza's eyes across the shadowed clearing, her face pale in the dying light. The rifle steady in her grip, despite the tremor he knew must be running through her. Dawn. It wasn't a deadline. It was a death sentence delivered on cheap paper. He moved back toward the cabin, every sense screaming against the stillness of the woods. The seekers weren't just watching. They were setting the stage. Inside, he barred the door again, the solid thunk of frail comfort. He smoothed the coarse note on a rough table beside the folded parchment fragment from Sarah's journal, the intricate crescent symbol and the cryptic phrase, "Where the crow's shadow falls." Eliza joined him, her gaze fixed on the note, then shifting to the strange symbol. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Sarah's." Amos said, the name thick in his throat. Hidden from before. He couldn't finish. She knew of them. These seekers was warned by a man named Brother Elias at the mission near Iron Creek. He tapped the phrase. This is a place? A clue? She called a guide should the darkness come. Eliza traced the complex lines of the crescent on the parchment with a trembling finger, then touched the simpler mark on her own wrist. The key, she murmured, echoing her mother's words. They think it unlocks something. A path. Power. She looked up, her storm-gray eyes fierce in the lantern light. My mother said it was a burden, a target, nothing more. But they believe fanatically. She met Amos's gaze. We can't fight them head-on. Not here. Dawn give them the light. Amos stared at the symbols, the crude threat and Sarah's enigmatic guide. An idea, desperate and fragile, began to form. Maybe we don't fight them, he said slowly. Maybe we use what they want. The moon. He laid out his plan, rough-hewn as the cabin logs. It hinged on the seeker's obsession on the terrain, and on a gamble that Brother Elias's clue held salvation, not just another riddle. Eliza listened intently, her initial fear hardening into a grim resolve. She didn't flinch from her role. When he finished, she simply nodded. I trust you, Amos Kane. The night crawled by, thick with tension. They doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. Amos sat by the shuttered window, the navy coat cold in his hand, listening to the symphony of the night woods, the rustle of small creatures, the sigh of wind, every sound amplified, potentially treacherous. Eliza sat near the door, the rifle across her lap, her breathing a soft counterpoint to the pounding of Amos's heart. He felt the weight of the tarnished locket against his skin, no longer just a relic of grief, but a link in a dangerous chain Sarah had unknowingly forged. He thought of her kindness, her secret smile over the locket's drawing. Had she sensed the shadow even then? Hours later, the deep blackness began to soften at the edges. False dawn. Time to move. Silently, they slipped out the back of the cabin, Amos leading, Eliza close behind, clutching the folded parchment. They moved like ghosts through the gray pre-dawn gloom, away from the clearing, following the course of the chattering creek upstream. The air was bitingly cold, smelling of damp earth and frost. Amos led them to a spot he knew well, a sharp bend where the creek tumbled over moss-slicked rocks, creating a constant roar that would mask sound. Above it, clinging to a steep, rocky slope, stood a solitary, lightning-blasted pine, its jagged silhouette stark against the paling sky. The crow's shadow? It was the only landmark that fit. Here, Amos breathed, pointing to a cluster of large boulders near the base of the dead pine, offering cover and a clear view back toward the creek bend and the path they'd left subtly marked. He took the parchment from Eliza. Show them this. Just for a moment, then get down. Stay hidden. Eliza nodded, her face set. She understood the risk, the lure. Amos melted back into the thicker pines downstream, finding a vantage point behind a fallen log, his Colt ready, his axe within reach. He watched Eliza take her position behind the boulders, a small, still figure in the gloom. The first true fingers of dawn, pale gold and rose, began to stretch across the eastern sky, illuminating the mist rising from the creek. They didn't have to wait long. 3 figures emerged from the trees downstream, moving with unnerving silence towards a cabin clearing. They were dressed in dark, practical wool coats and trousers, not the rough garb of miners or trappers. Their boots were the same sharp-heeled, unfamiliar pattern Amos had seen by the creek. They moved with a predatory cohesion, scanning the cabin, then fanning out slightly, drawn inevitably toward the subtle signs Amos had left pointing upstream toward the creek bend and the blasted pine. Amos held his breath. Eliza remained perfectly still behind her boulder. The lead seeker, a tall man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing, paused at the creek bend. His gaze swept the roaring water, the rocks, then lifted toward the dead pine. He gestured sharply to the others. They began moving cautiously upstream, towards Eliza's position. Amos's finger tightened on the Colt's trigger. Wait, Wait! The Seekers reached the cluster of boulders. The tall leader took a step closer, peering into the shadows. That's when Eliza moved. She stood up just for a heartbeat, unfolding the parchment so the intricate crescent moon symbol caught the first direct rays of the rising sun. She held it high, a beacon. The leader's eyes locked onto it, widening with fervent, almost religious hunger. "There!" he hissed, his voice cutting through the creek's roar. He lunged forward, disregarding caution. Now, Amos stepped out from behind the log, not toward the Seekers, but toward the steep, loose scree slope above the creek bend, directly opposite Eliza's position. He raised the Colt and fired a single, deafening shot into the air, not aiming at the men, but at the unstable slope above them. The report echoed like thunder in the narrow gorge. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The carefully loosened scree, disturbed by Amos's earlier work, gave way with a grinding roar. A cascade of rocks, dirt, and smaller boulders avalanched down the slope, directly toward the creek bend where the Seekers stood transfixed by Eliza's brief apparition. Panic erupted. The two flanking Seekers scrambled backwards, one slipping on the wet rocks near the water's edge. The leader, momentarily frozen by the sight of the symbol and the sudden chaos, was too slow. A tumbling rock the size of a melon caught him square on the shoulder, knocking him off his feet. He crashed into the churning creek, disappearing under the foam for a terrifying moment before surfacing downstream, battered and gasping, swept away by the current. The other two, avoiding the worst of the slide but thoroughly unnerved and seeing their leader incapacitated, hesitated. Their predatory confidence was shattered. They looked toward the boulders where Eliza had vanished, then back at Amos, who stood exposed, Colt now leveled at them, his expression granite. The advantage of surprise, the disorienting attack, and the loss of their leader broke their resolve. With a final hate-filled glare, they turned and fled back the way they had come, vanishing into the trees. Silence descended, broken only by the creek's resumed roar and the frantic gasps of the leader floundering downstream. Amos didn't pursue. He lowered the Colt, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. He looked toward the boulders. Eliza slowly stood up unharmed, the parchment clutched tightly to her chest. Their eyes met across the short distance. Relief, fierce and shared, passed between them, wordless and profound. They found the Seeker leader half-drowned and broken-legged downstream. Amos hauled him onto the bank, securing him roughly. Under Amos's grim stare and Eliza's quiet, unyielding presence, the man, his fanaticism dimmed by pain and defeat, spat out fragments of truth. The Seekers were a secretive order, obsessed with ancient legends of power tied to the crescent mark. They tracked bearers, believing them gatekeepers to hidden knowledge or places. Sarah? She'd been approached by Brother Elias, a former Seeker who turned away, fearing their ruthlessness. He'd given her the parchment for safekeeping, hoping it might one day help a bearer, like Eliza's mother or Eliza herself. Sarah's death had been the fever, cruel chance, not the Seeker's hand. But the shadows she'd felt had been real. They'd been searching near Iron Creek, drawn by whispers, just before she died. The mystery unraveled, leaving not fear, but a weary understanding. They delivered the captive Seeker to the reluctant sheriff in Iron Hollow later that day, spinning a tale of trespassing and attempted robbery. The man's ravings about silvered paths and moon women were dismissed as delirium. The other Seekers were gone, vanished like smoke. Back at the cabin, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and golds, the air felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of pursuit had lifted. Amos built up the fire. Eliza sat at the table, the faded blue ribbon on her wrist catching the firelight, the green shawl draped over her shoulders. The tarnished locket lay open on the table between them, the simple crescent drawing facing up alongside the complex parchment symbol, relics of a painful, interwoven past. "It's over," Eliza said softly, not quite a question. "For now," Amos replied, his gaze meeting hers. "Iron Hollow's not safe long-term. Word spreads. There might be others." He paused, the decision forming as he spoke it. I know a place. Further north. Good timber. Remote. Could build something new. Eliza looked at him, then at the locket, then at the flames. The ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first true one Amos had seen. It wasn't joy, but profound, hard-won peace. New sounds good, Amos Kane. She reached across the table, not touching the locket, but resting her hand, the crescent moon faintly visible, near his callous one. Together, Amos placed his hand over hers. The cool silver of the locket, the warmth of her skin beneath his palm, the crackle of the fire. It was a tapestry woven from loss, rescue, mystery, and a defiance kindled in the face of darkness. The past was a scar, but the path ahead, though unknown, was theirs to walk side by side. Outside, the first stars pricked the vast Wyoming sky. Inside the small cabin, two solitary souls, bound by a symbol and a $2 bid, sat in a silence filled not with loneliness, but with the quiet, resilient promise of dawn they had chosen together. The crescent moon on Eliza's wrist, finally free from the shadow of pursuit, seemed to catch the firelight, not as a mark of fear, but as a silent testament to survival and the fragile, enduring light of a shared future.